Hello and welcome to the very first edition or live stream of our new reading group called Understanding Class, where we cover Eric Olin Wright's classic Understanding Class by Eric Olin Wright. Let's see, we're exactly 1 hour late starting, so I think that's us starting exactly on time. What do we think? Who's there? Who do we have? Today we've got the core crew, all the way from, let's go to Derek first. We don't go to Derek first normally. All the way from Utah. Derek, how's it going?
I'm okay. Got stuck yesterday by the turned frog's gay needle. And what are they saying about the COVID vaccine these days?
The Bill Gates microchip.
Yeah, the Bill Gates. I got microchipped. It does kind of sting, so there's that.
Those are nanites.
I think maybe I feel a little bit,
Did they inject it straight into your ear? Is that where they put it?
Oh, no, straight into my arm, man. I feel strong. No, I don't feel stronger, actually. So we have that, and I'm getting over a mild case of leprosy, and that's only kind of a joke. So
social leprosy, though. Social leprosy.
Sure.
Then all the way from the mangroves, Esri, how's it going?
Yeah, here in humid, dank Arizona, here out in the savannah. It's pretty good. Actually, things are fucking great, honestly. Like, things going on in my personal life, my educational life, or whatever. And we're reading an analytical Marxist text. What could be better?
God damn you. God damn you, God. God damn each and every one of my patrons for making me read this godforsaken fucking book. Let me just say that.
You're going to understand class whether you want to or not.
I know. It should be called Browbeaten by Class. That's what this reading group should be called. Okay, then next all the way from Canada, we've got the main man himself, Kyle the Style Thompson.
I'm styling up here. Things are, they've been better, they've been worse, but hey, we're carrying on, and honestly, I think this book is a rock of straightforward, honest prose that I can just cling on to at this point in my life. So,
Oh no! Don't get to the end.
Yeah, I was looking at that and I was like,
Yeah, it's not perfect, but it makes a good Bible because there's a part that you just can't agree with. That's essential in every Bible, is that there's just a whole chunk that you absolutely reject.
I was about to say, when I read this book the first time after I did an interview with Eric Olin Wright that we lost, unfortunately, Moog and I did it, and I wish I released it, although I don't think it would have made him look super great, because when he explained it to me verbally, I didn't understand what he was talking about, and then I read the book and I was like, that makes way more sense than what you told me in the interview. But I was with the book, and then you hit that last chapter, and then I threw the book across the room and cursed Esri's name. I was like, Esri's old name. Why?
Oh my God. Well, this is the problems with the analytical Marxist, right? Methodological nationalism, sort of political conservatism, and basically rejecting most of what Marx said about economics.
I was about to say, you don't have it as bad with Wright. Wright does still accept, he tries to figure out another way to do most of Marx's stuff, but he does still accept most of it. But you read someone like Romer, and you're like, wow, yay, wow. How do you even call yourself a Marxist? I think there are neoliberals who are more Marxist than you, frankly.
Eric Olin Wright has a sort of interesting trajectory in his career where economically, I guess you can say it's a U-shaped curve, right? Where he starts off being a in public labor theory of value supporter, going through the literature as a sociologist, going through the literature and trying to do an honest defense of the labor theory of value as it stood in 1979. Then gives up the ghost and is like, this makes no fucking sense. This is all garbage. Like, in a way. And then following John Romer, develops a view of exploitation that does dovetail with some of the neoclassical stuff. And this is through Romer, and that it's distributional. It's a form of like distributional exploitation, which is one way that you could talk about like things in the Soviet Union or something. But it kind of does violence to the basic idea of what Marxian exploitation is. And then towards the end of his career, Eric Olin Wright creates a sociological criteria for exploitation that is much more based on production. And it just ends up being a way better abstraction of what exploitation is than in John Romer's work.
Is this
Romer,
yeah. Well, this is going to come up in this preface in the first chapter, but is this where the where he changes his distinctions from exploitation 1, exploitation 2, exploitation 3 to exploitation, dominion and oppression, which he separates out?
Yeah, I don't remember
because
that.
in his early class books, he has like 8 different kinds of exploitation, some of which aren't, frankly.
Oh, yeah. I think that's likely what happens. Honestly, I don't really read a lot of his earlier stuff, which is a shame because that's where all the empirical stuff is. But I just think that his late stuff is much more like erudite, and also kind of, if you change up the variables, you can have a pro-revolutionary worldview. just not as, not by the way that Wright expects things to go, but based on the model and then how deep in your heart things are going.
But I also like this book, unlike some of his other books on class, he doesn't try to come up with like, frankly, pseudo parsimonious like tables that only work because they're balanced, but you feel like he's making categories up to make the table work. I mean, I'm somewhat serious about that.
No. That is literally what he's doing. Like, that's not deflationary. He's literally trying to fill out the categories. Like, yeah.
Okay.
That's what you end up getting with thorough, like, truth table Marxism.
God damn it! I've just been editing that truth table session. I made yourself and Kyle sit in at the end of the Brumaire for 2 hours, literally. So I feel your pain, Derek.
You should have seen you should have heard the timbre of Tom's voice when I said that. Technically in Boolean logic, a true to false, true to false is the only way that a if then statement could be false. So all these other variations are true. And I think if he wasn't an ocean away, he would have tried to strangle me.
Yeah. I still have plans. Get me that get me that vaccine. Okay, so in preparation for today, so to make sure that we actually, we did an awful lot of, I think this book is very dense, so that if I don't do some preparation, we will get stuck in the weeds for an awful long time. So instead of reading like chapters, parts, which we can do, if there are notes, if there are particular bits anybody wants to read, we can read them. I've broken it down where I've basically, for each of the topics, I've just kind of made a lovely PowerPoint presentation. I hate PowerPoint presentations, but I think it might aid us in going through this in a finite time. So I have a couple of slides here on the preface, and then let me see just for a second. A couple of slides here. I can't see one. Let me just escape full screen here. Let me see. So we just have a couple of slides here in the preface, and then we get into the first chapter. So the preface is quite dense. So let's have a look. You've got three main agendas here. Let me just read them out for people and let's see and let people go with them in whatever way they want. So the book, he says there are three agendas. One is to interrogate approaches to class analysis across theoretical traditions. Okay. Two, to develop general frameworks of class analysis that can help integrate the insights of these different theoretical traditions. And three, analyze the problem of class conflict and class compromise in contemporary capitalism. Okay. So like, you know, we're going to see more of this in the first chapter where he gets into looking at these different traditions. Anything anybody has to say on the general approach he's going to undertake in the book?
I think that it was pretty vital for number one so that people understand that we have to have a nominalism with the word class. That when when people talk about class in like a Weberian sense or in a liberal distributionist sense or whatever, it's not that they're wrong. It's that they're talking about something completely different. And we also do need to overlay those things when we talk about class analysis. And that's to me a very serious flaw, because the way Marxists play with working class and proletariat, it is everyone and no one. It is in itself, and it is either politically construed or sociologically construed, or neither, or both. And while there are elements to that ambiguity in Marx himself, that doesn't help anyone like figure out who or what the hell we're talking about. And a lot of demagogues, frankly, use the fact that there is cognitive ambiguity in the way we use class to manipulate people. And I think sometimes the incoherence in the way we talk about class is built in and exploited hard.
Yeah. Whenever you get into analytical Marxism, you'll inevitably get into a dialectics versus analytics death spiral, where you can easily lose the virtuous qualities of both. But dialectic is like, at least classically speaking, like it kind of emerges from a good faith conversation, or maybe Socrates is in there too, or whatever, and trying to like build up a definition out of a back and forth. If you have a conversation that's fundamentally rigged and bad, you have to kind of bolster your defenses. And one of the best things you can do for yourself is to nail down what a term means so that you can track how far the goalposts are being moved. So yeah, it's not so much that, everything that was ever called dialectics is wrong and bad, but that, hey, if you want like a good way to manipulate people, one of the best things you could do is constant equivocation. So like, if you're trying not to be manipulated for some reason, trying to nail these things down for yourself is a good idea. And also, like, when you think about what a classless society is, what do we mean? That's, I guess, the second part, is that it's not only good for thinking things through and being defensive and not being manipulated. It's also good for trying to think fundamentally about the point of communism. What is class, and are we uncomfortable with putting certain things as class because it means we can't have our utopia? Or does that make sense to call that thing class even if it's inconvenient? Or it brings you through all these, like, I don't know, it's a big rabbit hole thinking about what class is, but it has the positive content of like, okay, if you can isolate what class is and you're for a classless society, which would be important, you're kind of figuring out in the negative what communism is.
Well, I'd just like to say, before Kyle butts in, I would just like to say manipulation good, clarity bad.
Oh,
I was just going to say that it's nice having these terms because it helps to cut through all of the Mott and Bailey rhetoric that you could play with class. by just sort of vaguely referring to these terms in whatever way is convenient. Yeah, which is just all over the place when it comes to any kind of not just Marxist rhetoric, but oftentimes any kind of like lefty populist rhetoric.
Yeah, no, I just sorry. Erica just in the chat said, "Tom, you fucking wanker." Sorry, so I was just, I was slightly. Ezra, your book there, your version of the book looks very thick. How many pages are in your version?
It's like I don't know, like the index is that like 257
okay.
or
yeah, no, whatever way
260?
the angle on the camera is, it just makes it look a lot thicker. Okay.
Oh wow, yeah, I don't know.
You know, yeah, I agree with all of what you're saying. Like, I think the clarity that we get in how he analyzes and breaks stuff down now, the writing style, I fundamentally object to. I find the writing so dry. But the analytical style of demarcating exactly what you're meaning, like mapping on stuff like, you know, how Marx talks about a class as a class as itself and a class for itself, you know, mapping them onto the Weberian just the way Weber talks and all that gives people a real notion about what class is, you know, whether it's relational or descriptive. I think it's clarifying, you know. It's definitely I think it's good, you know. I think it's good stuff. Let's try the second one. So here are the three different traditions he's going to and different causal mechanisms he's going to get into when we start discussing class. The first is, as Derek named them earlier, is like one is a stratification kind of a way of looking at class. This is the idea, like if you, I don't know, I used to work in a marketing agency, and like you would have these data sets you could pay from these marketing agencies, and they would or these data companies, and they would tell you what class everybody was in. These are A1, B1, C2. They divide up all the districts. Every address in the country in England is set up into these kind of stratification classes. So these are based like on individual attributes and conditions mainly. Then we've got our Weberian approach, which is he adds in this idea of opportunity hoarding, which we're going to get into a lot more in the next part. And then finally, we have Marxist definitions of classes, which are basically based upon exploitation and domination relations in production. Anybody have anything to say about these, the breakdown here?
Yeah, just the stratification approach is probably the one that is most commonly used in everyday life. Like if you are trying to navigate social situations and understand where the field of class forces is pushing, then typically you're going to read these stratification tags like, oh, you know, this person speaks with this accent, or they're wearing these clothes, or they went to this school, and you're going to act accordingly. So that one often takes up most of our mind share. But when it comes to strategizing or thinking more deeply about social relations, the second and the third are probably more useful. But yeah, I just don't want to discount that, like, everyone kind of thinks in the stratification sphere on a pretty regular basis in everyday life.
Yeah, I think the stratification sphere is interesting though, because we attach like this is something I got out of EndNotes Volume 4. How we conflate some of these things and attach images to like strata and like fetishize them. And he doesn't talk about that very much in this book. But I think that's interesting because it indicates to me that even when we're dealing in our regular life, we're actually wildly flipping between these notions of class without realizing it.
Yes.
And often in a way that, like, I used to talk about when I used to talk about theology, right? And this will take a second, but bear with me here. Like, I would talk about how people had incoherent notions of God, and like, it wasn't that people believed or disbelieved in God, because what they were talking about was not even logically possible, and they was flipped back and forth between the notions as they spoke. And I feel that way about class. If like I unfortunately, on another channel whose name I will not mention, had to talk about the bellows recently. And the way that there was the construction of this class that actually doesn't meet any of these definitions, but seems to. And they would also posit completely contradictory conditions, like precarity, but they're really the managers and they really run everything, but there's too many of them and they don't have jobs, but somehow they're in control of everything, and this is really a conspiracy to empower, like. And that's because of the fact people can't catch that this was incoherent, and because some of the sociological things it's describing seems true, but it's because it's flipping between all these notions of class rapid fire, and it's a big problem. And Marxists do this. I mean, the people who say this would call themselves Marxists, but like,
Right.
Marxists, even in the good tradition, I'm using having a bunch of finger quotes for people listening to this, also do this all the damn time.
Yeah, there's someone in the chat, a Marxist in the chat, that says only the last one matters. But like, even Stalin would focus on like individual attributes all the time to like ad hominem opponents and stuff. Like, I don't know if he really cared about it, but he certainly made a show of caring about it.
And
Like,
Lenin
He did too, you know.
Yeah.
I remember when he was like making fun of the Austrian Social Democrats because they used to always call each other doctor. You know, it's like, oh, you are real revolutionaries because you're so bougie with your academic degrees and stuff.
Well, if you're a Leninist and you think that only the third one matters, and you have a hard time explaining why Lenin actually called for the sociological study of classes and cultures to figure out how they worked. I mean, Gramsci didn't come out of nothing, and that was like, this is explicit in Bolshevik test. It's also explicit in early. Frankly, the Social Democrats, when they were still revolutionary, were also really bad about flipping between notions of class, and also by flipping between notions of class, flipping between aggregate and individual determinism, and flipping between voluntarism and determinism in general in ways that are fucking incoherent. And very few people have tried to reconcile this or call it out, and they hide behind, and frankly, it's hiding. It is basically, it is a sub-religious form of thinking. It is not even religious.
as in, it doesn't have the virtues of being religious, but
exactly.
It apes the poor reasoning.
It apes the core reasoning, where you don't want to deal with things by focusing on one thing, by which you actually also in your writings and advocacy don't really focus on. So it, like, on that sense, yeah, it is true that only the last one matters for why capitalism is the mode of production, which it is. Okay, good luck. You haven't done shit with that in 200 years. Grow up. Like,
well, I don't even think you can understand like the Spetsy and whole portions of the Russian Revolution if you don't understand opportunity hoarding. Like,
yeah, I think I would look at it. I feel like that the real core of capitalism is the Marxist approach, which that he really emphasizes. But like, even if you read the Premier, it's not like Marx just talks about one class and another class. He's implicitly saying there is like stratification, and opportunity hoarding for me is just like, an adjunct of exploitation or something. It's not the main dynamic. But I think there's like these three sections, I think, are required to fully talk about class in capitalism. That's the way I look at it. But if I was to say which is the most important driving one, you would have to say it's the Marxist relation in production. I think that's quite. Does anybody argue with that?
No,
Or
I mean,
is that the general? Is that what people think?
It's interesting that he kind of will get on to argue that the Marxist case is kind of a special case of the Weberian one. But yeah, other than that, I totally agree.
So
yeah. Oh yeah, I just wanted to harp more on this. You know, owning the means of production is the ultimate opportunity hoarding, because it opens you up to the job of being able to employ others.
Well, let's go on with this, because I do think I mean, yeah, I mean, he's right about this, and I think he's actually, to me, critiquing classical Weberianism, but we can get stuck in this because, like, particularly Esri and I have read this text. Esri, you've had me read it 3 times.
Really? Have
yeah.
Did I do that to you?
Derek,
well,
I've only read it 3 times.
Derek, do you have Esri's real world address, and we can get Puya to make a bomb and get him go Ted Kaczynski style on her?
Jeez, I'm not that important.
So basically, what we're saying here essentially is that what we're trying to do in this reading group, or maybe what Eric Olin Wright is doing, is the kind of equivalent what Marx was trying to do with value theory, and to disambiguate the word value into its component parts. Does that sound bullshit?
No. I mean, I guess a theory of surplus value would be the thing that you're referring to, more or less.
No, but the mixture between like value and use value and all that kind of stuff, and how the language itself caused a lot of confusion.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I would agree with that. I mean, Marx seizes on the fact that there is a distinction of use value in Adam Smith, for example, and whatever value is, but value, surplus value, abstract labor, those are not disambiguated in classical political economy at all. And then in neoclassical political economy, they just avoid the fuck out of them. So, like, I mean, all of them really. Like, it's not just value. They avoid like, they avoid talking about labor. They avoid talking about basically everything becomes about the market dynamics, and not anything about the production of commodities at all. So I don't know.
Okay, let's move it on. The final little bit in the preface then is about this idea of the game metaphor. Esri, do you want to take this slide? You're muted.
Tits. All right. Sorry, I was like, is this actually in the preface? And some of it, yeah, is in the preface. So I'm like, okay, cool. Yeah, this is borrowed from another author that makes a similar distinction in a political science context. And basically, in order to talk about these 3 aspects of class, it's useful to think of them as like 3 aspects of a game. You have the systemic level, which is about what game to play, capitalism or socialism. What happens to the surplus? Is there a surplus extraction process? Whatever. I think on the left, like on the, we're very serious socialists, Marxist left, we actually spend most of our time talking about the institutional level, which is conflict over rules of the game. What type of capitalism are we going to do? That's the opportunity hoarding level. And then the situational level, the sort of individual, sort of intersectional, like, aspect of class or whatever, like the lived experience of class, is conflict over the moves of the game. What individuals will do to navigate and play the game.
So I feel like I should have put pictures beside each one. The top one at the systemic level, we could have had a picture of Bernie, right? Then
he wants to completely transform the rules of the game.
Then the institutional level, we'd have a picture of Elizabeth Warren, Okay, and then at the
geez.
situational level down at the bottom, we might have Pete Buttigieg, and that would be that'll how we'd break it up. What do you reckon?
Oh God.
I mean, I think
That
there's
is
some.
dated and wrong.
I was about to say it's like that may have been true a few months ago, but I do think this of all the things we got into clarified my thinking. I've been ranting about how people didn't understand sectional class analysis, and they would go back and forth between like false consciousness and what. But I'm like, is false consciousness your immediate interest or your long-term interest? You're not actually clarifying this at all, and this really does. And so weirdly, if you look at what we just, I mean, this may be a function, I think it's a function of both the PowerPoint, no offense to you, Tom, but also the way it came in the book. If you look at the way the stratification, the Weberian, and the Marxist, this almost flips it. So the systemic is the Marxist level. Like,
yeah. So I probably just, it's probably just the order in the book they would count.
Right. And the institutional level is the Weberian opportunity capture that deals with credentialing, skills. It deals with a lot of stuff actually that Marxists tend to not want to talk about. And then we have the situational level, which is like stratification. Someone is poorer than me. Someone is richer than me. Someone has racial or gender privilege that I don't have, et cetera, and so forth. And this is why, for example, like people have, this book actually was one of the books that got me thinking about stuff like, what if we had a materialist intersectionality instead of just leaving it up to weird like standpoint epistemologists? Because if we use this is an intersectional multi-layer theory in which you can plug in non-economic factors into class analysis. Yeah. Without becoming a namby-pamby bourgeois liberal or pretending that intersectionality as a base concept, now it does now, but as in its original instantiation was somehow like a plot to destroy Marxism. I mean, I've seen smart people who are not class reductionists even say this shit. Like, it's actually a function of bourgeois law, but we could use the analytic framework in pairing with something like this, because even intersectional, like, oh, let's include class, race, and gender together, that isn't going to explain very much, honestly. You need a much more robust and multi-layered view of class between race, class within race. What's the institutional experience? What is the systemic experience? How do you deal with it on your daily life? How does this change? I mean, like, and if you're talking about this and ignoring all those questions, to most people, you sound like a weirdo.
You know, it's funny that you should say that this is a perfect basis for talking about, like, you know, or like gender class or like race class kind of stuff. Like, you know, the class aspects of those things and like the ways that Marxists want to talk about them but can't because they keep conflating it with like the fundamental mechanisms or something. Like, Eric Olin Wright himself is what you might call a multi-systems theorist, you know, thinking of class and, you know, gender as distinct systems, where, yeah, I see the same potential where it's like, oh, yeah, this is a good way of getting to, like, you know, I don't know, like sexed aspects of class or something. Whereas that's totally not where he goes with it at all. Although he would appreciate the analogy made of a sort of emancipatory, I don't know, logical structure of a social science, you know, kind of being copy-pasted onto another topic. So, like, he has a whole book where he does a sort of analogical feminist analysis that, again, he stresses is different than class analysis, but can kind of take on a lot of the same, like, long-term structural logics or something.
Right.
So, yeah.
I mean, to me, this is part of what I get to when I talk about how like class reductionists aren't actually class reductionist enough, because they aren't reducing things down to their various levels. They aren't looking at the way that they actually are experienced in daily life. They're not looking at class in a lens that reduces class to anything other than a kind of cultural or social understanding of what class is, which which I'm not against cultural central understanding of class. I actually think one thing that this book actually sorely lacks is incorporating Pierre Bourdieu and distinction and cultural capital as a kind of opportunity capture for access to real capital. And that's one of the only flaws I see in it, because it's kind of included in the Weberian framework, but it's not really. And
what Marx never thought about is clout. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, well, kind of actually. I mean, Bourdieu, that is Pierre Bourdieu's sole critique of Marx. Is Marx didn't talk about the way clout could be used to limit access and class mobility, and also to reinforce class not just stratification, but access to production, access to skills of production, etc. Like, there's so many ways in which taste is a code that gets you into educational modes, which can give you access to skills that can literally change your ability to run a business or whatever. Like it changes your access to real capital. And again, like I think something like this and enables us to put that in there. And if you put distinction in there, you then have to talk about things like race and gender, and because those are also key points of that. Like, there's no way out of it. And if you can put all this in a class rubric without saying that race and class are the same thing, because they're not. But you and not get into this whole like pissing match between race reduction and class reduction, which is frankly not just a waste of time. It's a very shitty way to understand the world. Like, you're not gonna be able to explain intra-racial dynamics that way. You're not going to be able to explain weird stuff that like basic liberal sociologists talk about better than we do. Like, one of the examples is like Pew stratification sociologists talk about how the intensification of the feeling of racism happens in the upper middle of the strata. So like, as other forms of dominion, oppression, and even class stratification leave, race becomes the primary barrier. All right. Now a Pew study can talk about that. Why can't Marxists?
Yeah, I pretty much had the same thoughts about that move that you could make with this framework when I was reading this first chapter. I was like, oh, hey, this is pretty interesting.
Yeah, he has a whole category of literature that he calls emancipatory social science, which I think is like a good way to kind of frame a lot of, cultural Marxism, like, and what they genuinely do have in common. At the basis of it is a theory of social reproduction, which betrays his, sort of structuralist Marxist roots, but in a good way. Like, people losing faith in the whole forces of production story and emphasizing relation to production, thinking about where those relations of production come from, is probably one of the like least insidious things about the whole Althusserian Marxist legacy, because it allows for, not that all the literature is great, but stuff like social reproduction feminism that is trying to do, which I think something like Eric Olin Wright gives you the tools for better than, a lot of Althusserian theory and structuralist, post-structuralist theory. Like, it allows you to talk about all kinds of problems, really. It is abstractable.
Right. You can model it. And from the commentariat that I actually think is useful, where the short, medium, and long-term interests, specifically economics, come into this. I actually think what long-term interests are ultimately going to be expressed in the systemic level, but the others play out at all the other levels. So short-term, like your situational interest, for example, if a boss plays if you're in a job, and sometimes Richard Wolff will get vulgar about this and make really dumb statements, but if you're in a job, for example, where it seems to you like you're turned down for a promotion because of
You don't play
preferential
golf.
hiring.
You
Yeah.
don't play golf.
You don't, but preferential hiring, or because you don't play golf, either one actually, they can lead to you having some. They can lead to you bringing out some other institutional and systemic cultural biases in ways that encourages, frankly, racism or sexism or any number of isms, actually. Now, but there's also a way in which the short-term interest, like my short-term interest as a teacher, is not always going to be in the same immediate interest as the short-term interest of a factory worker. My short-term interest as a worker in a city is not going to be in the same interest as a worker in a coal plant in the short term. It's just not, because I want my air to be cleaner, and they don't, and they need that job. And that, like, and in fact, your own short-term interest, depending on like in your different places in the sections of capital, can be in conflict with themselves if within you as an individual. And that's very much at the situational and institutional level. And it very much distorts, like when we talk a lot about barriers to understanding systemic politics, we actually often get stuck in that muck. And we're like, well, you just have to give up capitalism. And people are like, well, okay, but how are you going to do that? And until you do that, I have to deal with my immediate needs, which means I got to eat. And this was a problem that even someone like Kautsky recognized, and Sorel too. Actually, I know we keep on tying it back to those people, but it really, they saw, like, okay, the general strike will actually play out in a way where the short-term interest or the situational level interest of most of the proletariat will cause them to cave, unless you could already have enough power to take the state anyway, in which case, why don't you just do that?
I think the situation on the institutional levels, unfortunately, completely dominate most of the time. The times when the systemic level comes into play, in capitalism history, has been 3 or 4 times in history that the game has come into play. Most of the time, it's like, oh God, I'd like $2 extra an hour in my job, or
Yeah.
I wish I had. I'm going to move jobs so I can get to have a different job where my boss is not so much of an asshole.
Yeah, I hate to say it this way, but scientifically, that's sort of appropriate, right? Like, if you have a stable mode of production, or relatively stable mode of production, going from one historical epoch to the next it's like a huge breakaway, transcendent moment in a sense. Like, I don't want to be too dramatic about it, but like, it doesn't happen very often. So most people's lives are spent on the situational level, and at best, getting, like, winning some change at the institutional level. That's just, and even the idea of institutional change relating to the situational at all is, most of us probably have wanted to see something like that in our lifetimes, and have, gotten to thinking about the systemic level because of how often that's frustrated. And so, yeah, I conflated short-term with situational interests, which isn't exactly so, because, you could think of situational interests and, conflict over moves in the game in a number of ways on an individual level, or if you're forming a labor union, you want to outflank your boss, and you can't change the Taft-Hartley Act. So you could have, like, a more far-seeing kind of solidaristic union rationality on the situational level. So yeah, it's not strict on the short-term medium thing, but I think what I wanted to emphasize is that the systemic level is long-term.
I did have one point to bring up about that, which is where the that point about the Marxist definition kind of being a special case of their Weberian one sort of ends up flipping these a little bit or confusing them. And that is the point of the capital strike. Because the systemic level, right, like that, as you said, doesn't come up that often. But when a capital strike figures into people's everyday lives and struggles, it is actually immediately relevant, right? Like, where private ownership of the means of production is the last word in a localized social struggle that wins things for capital. And oftentimes it's like, yeah, we can't address the systemic level. Like that's just way out of our reach. But that is the immediate thing that's actually causing us to lose. It's like, well, the bosses are just going to lock us out, or the capitalists are just going to torpedo our economy because we're being too politically disruptive.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking at this now and I'm thinking like, systemic level, that's doesn't happen many times. You fall in love, doesn't happen many times in your life. Then you got the institutional level, is kind of like you start chatting somebody up in a bar or something, and then the situational level is knocking one out to Pornhub. This is what we're talking about here.
Yeah, that's what we meant by analogies.
Okay, Tom.
Yeah.
Tom.
I'm on fire. I'm on fire tonight. And Marcus Antonius in the chat says it seems to me that this is a matter of finding balance between individualism and collectivism, i.e. finding a balance between short-term gains and fighting for a broader revolution. It would seem to me, though, that like you can apply collective action to these three levels.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't think it's like an individual collectivist thing.
What is craft unionism, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. I would actually go on and make a big thing, because the analytical Marxists, as boring as they are really big on pointing out that there's a difference between aggregate, collective, and individual. And because collective, actually, you could actually take collective action that is good for the collective and bad for every individual within it. So at the systemic level, it looks like it would be matter, but at the institutional and situational level, it could actually be really damaging, to the point that it eventually collapses a systemic level change. We have revolutionary models for this happening, where so you can actually have, like, we tend to think of this as a binary, when even in Marx, if you read the German, he doesn't talk that way. Like a lot of times what we translate as collective is a German word closer to aggregate. And it's kind of a mess when we talk about individual versus collective action, because in some ways that binary is never true. Like there is never a time where it is in your interest to act solely collectively, and there's never a time where you can completely act individualistically. It just doesn't actually occur. And if that is a mythos in capitalism, then we should not give credence to that way of talking. And then one of the things I'll give the analytical Marxists, they're very strict on stuff like this, in ways that other Marxists just aren't, because they don't like being disciplined with words.
One of the best examples, I guess, I'm not so sure about collective interests that are bad for every individual. There are probably rules for that, unless we're talking about extreme emergent phenomena or something. Like I don't know.
Perowski's work on social democracy is based on some of the ideas of collective interest being bad for almost all individuals within the group.
Yeah, that is something that's strange credulity to me, but not outside the realm of analytical Marxism or whatever. But to speak to your point, one of the best things that talks about like altruism versus acting selfishly, and like in the analytical Marxist kind of umbrella, I guess, because they're ex-Marxists, is Bowles and Gintis's work on human nature. Samuel Bowles and Herbert Gintis. They they go through this whole book called A Cooperative Species and develop basically develop a definition of altruism that's like, no, it can't just be good for you. It actually has to like sacrifice something. And then they proceed to kind of show that people are still altruistic if you define it in this like really limited like way. Anyway, I don't know. I guess it's not exactly to your point, but it does point out that the analytical Marxists are very like strict about this in a way that we could afford to be. And frankly, in a way that's not like that. It's not that electric to talk about on the internet. But like, it can help us have a better conversation.
Okay. We're ready to move on. Let's go on to chapter 1. Dun, dun, dun. That was a 4-page intro in the book. It took 45 minutes. Should be easy getting through this.
You did introduce most of the important things there, though.
No, I'm only joking. It is good. It's good. Okay, so this chapter is called Towards an Integrative Analysis. So basically, okay, Ezra's going to, so basically, he's going to have a little look at each of those layers that we just talked about. The first being the stratification, then the opportunity hoarding, and then like the mass exploitation and domination layers. So let's have a look here first at stratification. Kyle, how do you feel about taking this slide?
Sure. So regarding stratification, this is one of the approaches we talked about already. So it's based on mostly attributes. Sorry, is it attributes or attributes? I never learned it properly which of those it is.
Attributes.
Attributes. Thank you. Yeah. So here in this approach, which is generally like what we've been describing as a liberal approach, class is neither identified simply with the individual nor with the material conditions of the life of people, but with the interconnection between these two. So you have these very sort of like complex descriptions. The key attributes here, education is the major one that people point to as like determinative of what your situation is going to be in life. And some sociologists include cultural resources, social connections, even up to the point of individual motivations. And then these clusters of these attributes make up, or like these clusters of attributes among individuals make up classes. Clusters of individuals and material conditions of life are called classes. So, you could have, say, like the country club set, right? Oh, these are people who belong to a country club. They can afford that. They live in this part of town. They play golf or they play some adjacent game. They have these kinds of business connections, et cetera, et cetera. That's your definition of class. So it's very like intuitively understandable, because when you think about like class resentment, like this is often what people point to, like, oh, you country club asshole, right?
Yeah, I think this is what like the way it's defined here is like the stratification model. It does kind of map on to like what I was talking about, peer-produced distinction, except that also this ties to income in a way that is a little bit hard to deal with. But yeah, like cultural resources, social connections, and education. But again, this actually shows how these interact with each other, because when you get to Weberian stuff and opportunity hoarding, education is the main legal I mean, I know it sounds weird because we're talking about skills, but credentialing is often just a legal way of cartelization, and education is totally tied into that in our current society in a way that's like highly destructive, actually.
Yeah, so he explicitly says in this chapter that Bourdieu's work straddles the stratification approach and the Weberian approach.
Yeah. Yeah, and he does sometimes use Bourdieuian as the stand-in for stratification, even with that qualification. So, like, that is there. Although I think Wright would put the gradations of income on strictly in the stratification approach, because he has like a little table that we skipped on page 10 that's like, like this. Like, let's see.
Okay. Do I not get to it? I'm trying to see, do I get to it? Stratification.
Well, I don't know, but the point is that there's the
this one.
Yeah, there it is.
Okay.
Oh, I guess it's later in the book too.
Yeah, we're going to get to it.
Okay, great. Yeah, just the point is that yeah, we'll get to it. Yeah, we'll get to it. It's fine.
Okay. Yeah. No. Sorry. Yeah. So.
Because yeah, the income. I'll just say it. Income gradation and the whole like way of looking at class that isn't fundamentally relation based is all that's all mashed into the stratification, and so income would be the most substantial, economically substantial, thing in stratification, essentially. Like,
yeah, it's just that oftentimes your opportunity hoarding is identified primarily by an attribute you have, right? Like Derek was saying, being credentialed puts you in a group that is opportunity hoarding.
Okay. Yeah. So I've got we kind of talked a bit through this. We talked about the different stratification. Like one thing, like it is kind of funny, like, libs, one thing I'd like to ask somebody who might know some about this, like in what way is education becoming less of a thing for allowing you to get up into these upper stratifications? Is that link seems to be breaking down?
It both is and isn't. So this is literally my day job, so I can speak on it pretty accurately. Education is increasingly required for jobs that did not require education. So there is a punitive mechanism now for not having it. And I think that's a better way to understand it than a benefit to having education. This is something also a lot of when we talk about like the post-leftists, they deliberately ignore this. They'll cite the aggregate stat that like 2/3 of Americans don't have education. They ignore that is not true. If you look at under 35s, where that literally flips, almost, I think it's something like 60 to 65% have some level of college education. Because if you entered the labor market in the 1980s, jobs that used to require not even a high school education. I mean, I worked with people when I worked at Geico 20 years ago, when I was literally starting this job when they were doing this shift where you could go into Geico to work certain jobs with a high school education, and your boss would also just be high school educated, maybe be a high school dropout. Whereas now to get the same job, you needed at least an associate's degree, if not more. So the education is no longer allowing you into the upper echelons unless you were already in the upper echelons and have access to Ivy League education, because as more and more people get educated, it as a commodity becomes less of a useful door into the upper class, or the middle class or whatever, because there's I hate to sound like Peter Chincham, but there's interleague competition, which pushes the credentialing down. And that actually moves the criterion from, so if you look at like this, upper class, lower class, under, I think it's weird that he lives out middle class, but whatever.
I don't think he actually does he? I think it's in the book.
Okay. He has a whole like kind of empirical breakdown of classes where the middle class is ironed out. But that's in the preface. I keep blurring what's in the preface and the first chapter.
This is also in this chapter, because I only read chapter 1 to prep for this, and there's definitely a discussion of the middle class.
Okay, great.
So what used to be required to get into the upper class is now required to get into the middle class. What used to be required to get into the lower middle class is now required to get, it used to be required to get a middle class, will now get you into the lower middle class. And that does have to do with, what someone like Peter Turchin would call elite, which I think is totally misleading, overproduction. Because it's not really that elites are being overproduced. It is that you have increased competition for a similar or even smaller amount of elite spots.
Kyle, you are correct. I just missed putting the middle class into that. That's my fault. So just assume that's there. I'm not going to put it in now. Fuck it.
Stratification, Purdue, economic, cultural, social capital. Yeah.
Yeah. So he talks a bit here about the stratification of Pierre Bourdieu. Who knows? Who wants to describe who this French geezer is?
I can, because I'm highly influenced him. Pierre Bourdieu is a French sociologist who was strongly influenced by Marx, but kind of differentiated himself in the 1970s from the Marxist school, who is actually concerned with empirical studies of the classes in France. He also looked at the way culture worked as a code of gatekeeping and how like social capital could get you. The one thing that I think Pierre Bourdieu is often taught wrong in the United States, where cultural, social, and economic capital are seen as distinct, whereas Pierre Bourdieu actually sees cultural and social capital as actual means to economic capital. They're not completely separate categories. And I was a little confused about if Owen Wright was actually spreading the misinterpretation in this book of what's going on. Because if you read Pierre Bourdieu's most famous book, Distinction, that is largely what he's writing about. So I do think, for example, the Marxist debate around PMC, right, which is a totally incoherent class category, like it really is, even from this perspective, and I've ranted about why, but it feels real to most people because it is the way they experience this downward push of credentialing, and the fact that there's more punitive for not having education, but you get less and less for having it. Where there seems to be an increase of importance, particularly in lefty spheres and social and cultural capital. And I will also say that there are a lot of things in which, I mean, I hate to say it, but like anti-racist, anti-sexist, I don't really hate to say it, I'll be honest, anti-racist, anti-sexist language games on the left are forms of social and cultural capital.
Yeah, I think that's lost on very few people.
Right.
You know, like that, like it's, you know.
I don't know. I think Esri, it's lost on most people. Like it is not
really
seen. Yeah.
Because like I sometimes wonder if we don't just talk to a lot of like, you know, people that are super righteous about it, because I think people that are not like politically aligned or something, but even have like a sort of sociological interest in, you know, just because who they are in like anti-racism, anti-sexism, you know, being pro-queer or whatever, like can also tell when someone is pandering to them. Like I feel like
but this is also,
I feel like most people feel this.
They do.
Maybe I'm wrong.
I feel like it's like the difference between somebody just like not being an asshole and being like
right,
and being like some kind of annoying
right, making a big show of it. Like I think this is something that within the left or even left sympathetic people become sort of like intentionally stupid about, because it makes it hard to deal with expressions of our values otherwise.
Well, I see what you're saying, but I think when I teach high school, people do not see this as expressions of cultural and social capital. They see it as common courtesy. But it is interesting to me that you do have to have a background of a certain education level to use the right words. And the biggest expression of this that people make a big deal of right now is Latinx, which I actually personally don't use. I tend to use Latin or Latin to still respect the gender neutrality, but not use a very strange in the native language and in English created term, because it doesn't have any influence in larger Latin society in the United States hardly at all. Like it is specific to an educated class, and study after study shows this. And that educated class isn't even that Latin, honestly.
Well, right. Do you think that's like so what I'm trying to say is that, you know, broadly speaking, and maybe this is a case that is really visible, right? That, you know, Latin American people, when they see Latinx, you know, how do they feel?
I think they feel it as alien for the most part.
and I'm kind of extrapolating from this. I think this is the relationship that most people have to these sort of signifiers.
Okay. So we're kind of agreeing, but kind of like I'm saying that I don't think people realize it's cultural capital like in any articulate way, including people who promote it. Like,
Okay.
I don't think the people who are promoting this language think they're promoting a form of cultural capital either. Like I don't. Like I don't. I think they're acting in good faith.
There's a small amount of them that are probably aware, but I think you're mostly right.
Yeah, but yeah, I do think when someone says "stay in your lane," that's pure cultural capital stuff. That's what that is.
Yeah, I've seen that kind of, you know, sharp elbow shit too much to think that people are completely unconscious of this. Like, however, I do think that this is probably it's a sort of quintessential internet experience or whatever to get really caught up in something that seems to share your values, only to feel outcompeted and elbowed out of the way about it in a way that kind of harms your relationship with your own values.
Do you think it's just internet? Because one thing that P.H. Higgins says in the comments,
I don't think it's just.
like,
I don't think it's just internet, but like you need a certain amount of exposure to people with your own values, or that, you know, claim to have your own values in order to have this experience. So you could, you know, move to the big city before the internet and have this experience or something, or go to school and have this experience. But the fact that you can have any opinion and go to the internet and be swamped with people that have your opinion.
Okay.
You know, that's the difference. It makes this experience is more universally accessible.
So one thing I'll say about this, two things it brings up to my mind. One is P.H. Higgins in the chat was talking about how Pierre Bourdieu was actually analyzing the French Communist Party's use of its own institutions and social networking to get capitalist clout, and to get opportunity in business and whatnot, which we also see pretty clearly in leftist stuff now. The other thing that I would say, though, and this is one of the things where the punishment for not having education becomes more obvious, is that the value of these key terms and the internet has decreased. Like when we talk about these terms in the early aughts and in the 90s when I was just in college, you pretty much did have to have a college education to have encountered the term, I don't know, heteronormative. You did. Like, and that is no longer true for good and ill. I think it's good that these ideas are out there, but I think it's also like it also creates a kind of a Red Queen game on these terms that didn't exist before. And I do think we see it on the left. Like it is almost impossible to keep up with the improper nomenclature. And it does give you access to real capital. I mean, I think that's like explicit.
Yeah, or deny you access to capital. Like, yeah.
I mean, what is canceling? But
like, if you are in the media sphere
mm-hmm.
of any kind, you're probably terrified about this because you can lose real capital, real economic opportunities because you weren't sophisticated enough.
Or
you can lean into it and get the big bucks. Let's be honest. What's the dirtbag left?
Tom, I think if you go into like real media sphere, you do not get big bucks from going down into conservative sphere. It's just because we're in the shit end of the stick where there's no money is where it looks like it's appealing.
Like people like Cumtown and all that, like,
yeah,
you know what I mean?
But
they lean into being the opposite of that. They just do. Like, there's no getting around it. Like, their language they use is the same language as I would have used growing up. You know, that's the same sense of humor.
Well, yeah.
Like, I mean, it's hard to articulate that this is a sort of like I want to say like a small sphere thing, and I know Cumtown is pretty big podcast, but like it only works because they're counter signaling. You know, the whole dirtbag thing only really works because of the weird special dynamics of like leftist media and the fact that there is such a rock star job market in there. And I guess they're all rock star job markets. And what I mean by that is, you know, a million wannabes for everyone who makes it. But the fact that you could be one of the top 20, you know, You could be one of the top 20 podcasts on Patreon or something, or you could be, you could be number one podcast on Patreon if you win the Leftosphere. You could be the number one Patreon versus, what most people make. Like that makes it somehow unique. Because I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if I'm generalizing too much, but you're probably not going to make number one Patreon being a Minecraft podcast or something.
No, you're probably not. But also, number one Patreon is how many dollars a month?
True crime, and it's like about $170,000 a month.
Yeah, and then you get into Left Podcast, which is a lot less. But you break that down, you figure that out, and then you look at what, like, say, an old media figure, even in a dying sclerotic market, which is why there's so much push in. It's why there's so much push into the left superstar market. Let's be honest. Like, you increasingly see like people on the dirtbag left with Ivy League degrees and who had heavy investors putting money into their Patreon to inflate it in the beginning as an investment app. I mean, like, people, this is how this works. So the reason why that is, though, is because the real money, real capture, real social clout, all that stuff, for more people it's actually in the standard liberal media, in which case canceling does affect you. I'm also gonna say, like, I think one of the reasons why this has become such a lefty weird obsession is because it's weaponizing something negative about, frankly, middle class culture for good and ill. But it is essentially a middle class strata issue, and it doesn't work on certain people. Like you canceling me from the internet, easy. Canceling me from my job for a leftist to do, really hard. And a right winger could actually probably do it a lot easier, frankly. So it's one of those things where, like, we get caught up in this, and this is why I get tired of the cancel culture debates, because it gets us playing into these two strata without dealing with the fundamental problems of these two strata, or without like, these two being cultural and social capital, and without like dealing with the larger economic problems. It just seems so myopic to a very tiny portion of the economy.
Yeah, it's a very middle class thing. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, which I think, I guess, like, the media sphere. See, I'm trying to, like, figure out, from the inside, I guess, how much of left media dynamics is a general operating of class, and how much of it is kind of special because of the subject matter. How much is it form? How much is it content? So yeah. Anyway, I think we should keep going on with the general.
I think the last thing I will say about that is just that, because of the relationship between the left thought and credentialing, there's an overwhelming bias for those two things to be connected, right?
No. That's great. That's a great point. And a Weberian sort of point, mostly, except for if you go to the right university, in like a Bourdieuian sense or something, I guess.
Right, but this is why I think people are talking about the post left right now, which again I'm fucking tired of. But this is why they have so much purchase with a certain amount of, like, people who are real workers, even though the class war that they're concerned about doesn't actually involve the working class at all. It is, if you actually read them closely, it's explicitly between different elite groups. And I will say that when I was looking at the Great British Class Survey, the one thing I found interesting is that it doesn't deal with things like let's go through elite, established middle class, technical middle class, new affluent workers, traditional working class, emergent service workers, and precariat. You'll notice that, like, shop owners and stuff are not even on it. Like, they don't even exist in it.
Yeah, like they don't really exist in England, do they? Really? Like say, for example, you go in London.
Hang on, the nation of shopkeepers doesn't have shopkeepers.
Yeah, like, I'm deadly serious. They don't exist. Like, you look in the 1970s, there was a really big British comedy Open All Hours about like this northern. Have you ever watched?
I have seen it.
Yeah, with Ronnie Corbett and the guy who plays Del Boy from Only Fools and Horses. And like, you know, it's a small shop and there's two white guys working in the shop, Granville and his uncle, and they're like, you know, blah, 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 hilarious, whatever. And, but like you go to London now or go to any northern town, I'm sure it's the same anywhere else. You will never, ever see a English white person working in a corner shop. It doesn't happen. Whatever has happened to like that whole class of English society now, I don't know. Are they chains? Are they small little ownership? Usually they're like Asian, you know, Indian subcontinent people from there. It's like that whole like class of small little petty bourgeois in England. I don't know where it is. Like in London, it hardly exists.
And
a lot of those people are probably folded into precariat, honestly.
I was saying
if you're thinking about what kind of income they're making, they're probably not having a good time.
But go ahead, Tom.
No, like those corner shops, they can only survive because they're usually run by like an Asian family who is probably getting paid super low, doing super long hours, and I think a lot of the time they're actually owned by some rich Indian relative or Indian capital. You know, like so that, and they're getting paid. You know, they're probably not getting paid minimum wage. They're working like crazy hours. They'd probably be in the precariat or 6 emergent service workers. That'd probably where they would lie.
So I found it interesting that an American would use the British class survey, though, because that trend in the United States is similar. If you go into cities, most of the owners of small shops are immigrants. There's 2 reasons for that. Yeah. One of the things we talk about all the wokeness of a big capital. It's still not woke enough to hire a lot of workers who don't speak very good English. And those workers tend to open up their own small businesses, and they do okay, actually, in certain parts of the United States. They're also, once you get out of cities, you still meet boutique shop owners and small business owners, particularly truckers, actually, in the U.S., which is a much bigger sector. Like, it is the largest sector of employment. And I put employment because a lot of them are not technically employed in the United States. So you have this large, we do have a large petite bourgeois. It's a mixture of immigrants and rural boutique stuff. Rural and suburban, actually more rural and extreme suburban boutique stuff that you don't have in Europe or don't seem to have in Europe in the same way. And when a lot of Americans talk about the traditional working class, they lump a lot of these PB people into that in the strata.
Like I would say as well here, in case like you're not so familiar, like in England, middle class means really, really goddamn rich. Yeah. Yeah. So like, for example, like what's the name of the one who married the Prince William, Kate Middleton. Right. Like she would technically be called middle class.
Right.
Millionaires.
Whereas in America, we define middle class, literally, I think at some point, define middle class as between like $10K under the median income, which is like $40K and above per year, all the way up to like $350,000 per year in income, because they do kind of have it stratified in that way. And so the middle class in the United States is defined unbelievably broadly.
Yeah.
So
it's defined broadly, so you don't have to ever say working class. You just have middle class. Like in England, middle class actually means, like I would say, established middle class means people with at least probably no joking, probably at least £5 million worth of assets, or maybe 2 million pounds worth of assets. But like established middle class are people that go to Eton and things like that, you know?
Yeah. So this is interesting to me because it's one of those things where the American left and the British left are always talking about to each other and using the same words and mean completely different shit by them. Yeah.
Incommensurability in the same language because of national framework. You'll have to see it.
Like, what do you call it? Lex Whitfield in the chat just said like they called whatever her name is Kate Middleton a commoner before the marriage. That's true. She's the first princess, commoner princess.
Well, it's because England never completed its pathetic and anemic bourgeois revolution by properly getting rid of its caste system. which is why like I
Right.
was always more tolerant of like Mark Fisher talking about working class in cultural terms, because I was like, oh, that makes sense in England because you still have nobility in a real legal way, where we don't. We have de facto. I mean, we're more, and yet we're. I don't know. Are we more unequal than Britain? That's actually hard to say. I think the most
Probably.
Similar. No, I think I think they're quite similar.
It's the two most unequal in the OECD are U.S. and Britain.
Right, and the most unequal on Earth is the most Gini coefficient unequal on Earth is China.
Yeah.
So
Brazil is not far behind it. Like it's interesting you say that because oh no, it's just interesting, like, because like I know Precious here when she bought the house, she bought her house on a freehold. Like most of the property in London, like, is leasehold. So you buy the house and all you're buying is a 100-year lease, and you have to keep paying money to renew this lease to like Lord whichever the what. Like it's kind of it's proper feudal relations. Like you go like the center, all of London, all like the richest man in Britain is Lord Westminster, and he basically owns all of the center of London. He literally owns the whole thing.
complete your bourgeois revolution.
Yeah. And, yeah, I was going to say, English needs, the English need a bourgeois revolution, like
Finish
you
it.
didn't check the box. You didn't check the full box.
I'll get them going. It's interesting here, like, because in the UK, like, this language of the precariat is dominant in the left in the UK. That the left in the UK is basically, the kind of Labourite left, it fully falls into this worldview of stratification, like Novara media analysis and all this precariat. Oh my God, The Guardian. Like, this is the stuff they talk about.
So
10 years ago, it was a big deal here.
Yeah, we gave it up.
I didn't know that. I didn't know it was big over there too. God damn it.
Yeah, well, it came with the beginning.
Pretend it was the mid-20th century.
Yeah. Well, the thing was with the precariat is interesting, is like it actually does describe what's happening to a lot of people in all. I'm pointing as if the people can see it. In categories 4, 5, and 6, all those people in the United States are potentially gig workers. Even people who are somewhat established, like the whole debate are like, are teachers workers? Because some people will even define it on income, because teachers are weird. We are highly credentialed, and we make no money for our credentials. But if you look at us in the aggregate of all jobs in the United States, we are just slightly dead above center. Now, there are certain states where teachers really are a labor aristocracy. Ezra used to live in one, but in general, teachers do slightly better than most hourly workers with a full-time job, but only slightly. And given their debt loads, they tend to need to take on more work, so they do tend to be precariat. And also, they don't tend to stay teachers. I mean, I think 50% of all teachers quit the job within 3 years. So, and they don't tend to go up in class once they quit. Just pointing that out. So, so yeah, and I think the reason why I don't use precariat anymore is unless you're independently wealthy in the United States, you are. Like, you can, like, we have downward class mobility as a threat at all times, all the time, constantly.
That's the way it should be. That's the way it should be. Let's get it straight. We want to keep you working hard.
Classic Marxist immiserationist here.
Yeah. Okay, let's go on to the next slide here. Let me read this. So he says it's important to understand how people acquire the attributes that place them in one class or another. These are like these stratified classes we've just talked about. The economic status is based on their employment. Focus on the process which people acquire, the cultural, motivational, and educational resources that affect their occupations in the labor market. Particular attention is given to the early conditions of life, your family, and the class character of the family settings is thus key to how these attributes are acquired. So there's like this really big emphasis on like your parents, are they like into education or are they rich? It seems to and it puts it links your status in the world to your employment. You know, how many people can get these jobs? Like, what's the qualification you need to do to become say, the Lord of Westminster, you know, Earl of Westminster, Duke of Westminster? Like, how can I get that accreditation? Does anybody know?
Yeah, marry the princess.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is, again, it kind of gets into that opportunity hoarding, right? Like, the aristocracy are obviously opportunity hoarding.
Yeah, everything is opportunity hoarding. Your clothes are opportunity hoarding. Actually,
well, no, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying,
no,
like,
I'm joking.
You know, when they call Kate Middleton a commoner, you know, that's an active form of opportunity hoarding, as opposed to just by you know, attributing that to her, right? The activity is opportunity hoarding.
Well,
Yeah, maybe let me, I guess I could maybe frame some of this in a way that stratification is the way by which opportunity hoarding and, you know, class exploitation and domination are lived. Like, you don't, like, unless you're looking at the balance sheet, you're not seeing exploitation, you know, unless you're like really thinking about relations between you and the boss, you're not thinking about domination.
And
like,
importantly, like, as it says in that table, the stratification approach is non-relational.
right.
So when you get to, like, how does that happen through relations, you're often making reference to the other two.
Right. Like, opportunity hoarding is probably the one that, or domination, probably the ones that will actually, like, kind of occur to people more than exploitation as the structural characteristics. But it's all kind of worked out on the individual level, and, you know, dealing with people's smugness or their, like, sense of entitlement, or alternately, you know, their sense of, you know, that they're not entitled to anything, and, you know, being like, whoa, what is that?
Let's have a look here. This is Kate Middleton's parents' house. This is their 1.5 million mansion in the countryside. Sit there with, like, their exterior garage, 3-story house with, like, a couple of SUVs in the yard. Like, their house is worth 1.5 million. Like, so that'll give you an extension of what, like, what counts as a commoner in England.
Are you saying they only have one guard quarters? That's it?
That's it. I think so. Like, yeah. And
Pish posh.
No wonder the British and the Americans think they understand each other and really don't ever.
Like when somebody in England says middle class, that's what they actually mean. They mean, like, somebody who owns houses like that in the country. So it's such a different term.
That is what we used to mean in the United States before the housing crisis. Like, you could have a big McMansion in the sticks. I swear to God.
But not like that.
No, that's different.
Not like the guard quarters, I suppose. But it would, okay, not be
you can't
$1 million.
You can't compare, like, I mean, like, you can't compare a house like that in England to a house like that in America, because everything, like
no, that's fair. That's very fair.
Yeah, like, that's just a whole different kind of thing. Okay.
Yeah, I was about to say, if I saw that, I did see some of the things built in Georgia right before the housing crash. We would have never considered someone who owned a house that big middle class.
Yeah. Like,
well, middle class is such a, like, broad, vague category that people that lived in those houses did think of themselves as middle class, but, like, upper middle or something.
Yeah, that's true. That's probably fair.
Yeah. I think, like, probably, like, in British terms, just everybody was in the underclass. Let's be honest. They're all ruffians. Like, you know, so the extremely wealthy people were the middle. Okay, so he really likes these kind of diagrams in the book. Before I got the actual copy of the book, I had to build the diagrams. So I have a PDF it now. I can just copy and paste them. But I built this one here. So this is like a diagram where he has, like, you know, some arrows and some. He's trying to explain the process that stratification theorists kind of understand, how they understand class. So it goes from one bubble. The first bubble says various social background conditions in an individual's life. And then that leads to class relevant attributes of individuals. And that goes on to your job or your occupations. And that goes on to your levels of individual economic well-being. So like entirely missing from any of this is like any type of like Weberian, so hoarding, you know, trying to keep other people out of certain types of jobs or roles, or the relations of production, any exploitation or anything. It's situating things nearly entirely in like this individual has this type of family and this type of education, they get this type of job, and then this is their pay. That's the way, that's their understanding.
Which is
the only kind of relations that this approach is interested in is how attributes relate to attributes.
Right. Although that confuses me that this is what I was talking about, his misunderstanding of Bourdieu, because Bourdieu doesn't think that at all for this stuff. He does see relations of both production and consumption actually as being vital to how this works. And so I guess that's what he means by saying Bourdieu straddles the Weberian and the stratification approach. But I'd be like, in practice, I actually think it's a different approach.
Yeah, it seems to me
sure.
like the one thing he says here, Derek, I kind of feel it too, but he said here for Pierre Bourdieu that the 3 dimensions of economically relevant resources are, but it's which individuals possess. So even though he talks about economic capital, cultural capital, social capital, it's in the individual and not in the class. Is that his point for any?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, but that's because Bourdieu is trying to talk about the way the individual's taste and psychology, and so even their experience of things like symbolic violence, a term that has been much abused on the left. I'm actually probably going to do a video explaining on Monday. Comes up because it's the individual experience of something that is relational in a system that the individual experiences, and so it's trying to phenomenological, it's like a sociological phenomenology. Like, you are likely to experience this because of these systems, because of your relation as an individual to these systems. So I think it's kind of a misreading to say that he thinks that it's actually the individuals that are setting this up. It's just that that's how you experience it. And that's, to be completely honest, that is how you experience it. You don't experience anything as an aggregate. So like, yeah. Anyway, good. Let's go on. I just want to make sure that other theorists of class are fairly represented.
What if you were like,
that's fair, but it's true. We could say this generally about Bourdieuians or something. Like, I don't know if Bourdieu, if the late Bourdieu ends up stressing the different kinds of capitals or something, but it's certainly something that I've seen out there that, Pierre Bourdieu, I guess perpetuating the Anglo reading of Bourdieu, like, has these 3 categories of capital, and let's use this to get around economic capital, which, that's the exact kind of maneuver I would expect people to do with someone who's originally trying to enrich Marxist class sociology or whatever.
Well, and I think you're right about that, because one thing I remember getting yelled at by a sociologist who knew Bourdieu well and pointing me to what I'm talking about right now, was that I was taught Bourdieu as if the cultural, social, and capital were social, cultural, and economic capital were completely distinct spheres, and like, you had power bars almost, and like them, and like, you individually might have a lot of, but that's not actually, when someone went back and told me to reread Distinction without that lens that I was taught, I then saw that wasn't what Bourdieu was talking about at all. That's just the way it's been used in America to basically justify I would like to call this our bureaucratic stratification system, because I don't think anyone exactly invented it. It's just the way that like government bureaucrats actually do stratification tables, like it is. So
yeah, because there's like a tractable quantification variable that you can use to look at income brackets or something. Like, I think that's ultimately what makes this most, and it's individualizing, which it's quantifiable and it's individualizing. Bureaucrats love that shit.
Yep. Use it for means testing. Yay!
Yeah, but also it does include those first 2 causal things are a big deal in when Marxists discover this. Like, oh my god, like I never really thought about that. I know this sounds kind of like reductionist or unfair, but a lot of Marxists aren't maybe deeply invested in investigating their personal life and how they became who they are. And so at some point, usually Marxists discover their own sort of post-material needs and realize how these things came about. And then, you know, I don't know, that's where a lot of like the Frankfurt School or, you know, psychoanalysis kind of Marxist interest comes about, I think, to be really deflationary. But, you know, that stuff also has an economic basis. And so there's like, I don't know, it's like having this, even in the sort of maybe, you know, not understanding Bourdieu or, you know, kind of cutting it off from this or that, like incorporating these things is still a virtue. This is what I like about his approach, is that you could still name the virtues, and he calls this a, you know, calls this like a virtue-centric sort of synthesis for a reason, because you can identify these processes, which, you know, they just like are in Marxist ideas of class. They're just not really well named.
My experience of Marxists who go on about that kind of social capital stuff that you hear in the media, most of them are literally using it to increase their social capital as much as they can. It's kind of like a self-help book for like becoming a bread tuber.
I remember reading a paper that was like, well, social capital is good, actually. Anarchists should use more social capital, which was like woefully pre-internet. And I wonder what that person thinks about social capital now. Yeah.
Okay. So stratification. So we're going to talk about what's missing from this approach. So he says here, 4 main points. Any consideration of the inequalities in the positions themselves that people occupy. Education shapes the kinds of jobs people get, but how should we conceptualize the nature of the jobs that people fill by virtue of their education? And why some jobs are better than others, you know. Yeah, it's so true. Why do some jobs confer a great deal of power? Like, even within like the middle class, it always struck me, a friend of mine, she was studying to become an architect, and like her architecture degree was so intense. And like another friend of mine was like studying to be a doctor or something, and they were probably just as intense. And the doctor gets paid like literally 5 times as much. Like, even when it gets even to the middle class stuff, like there's some of these things are just so I don't know, they're so particular. Anybody want to take on some points here? What does he mean here by the inequalities in the positions themselves that people occupy? Anybody?
Like the underlying, basically like the underlying structuring relations at all.
Like, yeah. So like what, both in like, okay, I'm a manager and I make so much money, and this person over here is a plumber and they make up actually the same amount of money as me. And there are inequalities in these positions, both socially and also in terms of power and also in terms of production. I mean, there's a real sense in which, for example, if I'm a small business owner, I really truly own my capital, my income may be the same as any like mid-tier worker, but I do have access to things and economically, socially, but mostly economically, that other people don't. Like I can get lines of credit that workers just can't get, et cetera, and so forth. I also think that, you know, the inequalities in domination is not considered, and it's interesting that he puts domination in the Marxist category, because he does, but like he has to admit that it's actually absent in Marx like entirely, because Marx talks about oppression and exploitation, but can't explain boss, like non-owner boss relations. It does kind of come up in the idea of labor aristocracy and stuff like that, but it's, if you look at the economy that Marx was writing about, it's so nascent at that time period that it really, you get why Marx wouldn't have wrote that much about it, because it wasn't as big of a sector. But domination clears up a lot of stuff. Like, why do I hate my boss more than I hate my owner? And most people do. I mean, I personally don't, because I'm a teacher, and my relationship is, my owner is technically the state of Utah. and my boss is another salaried employee who sort of makes my job actually sometimes better, sometimes worse. But for most people, when I was working like at like I don't know, a franchise, right? I didn't hate the franchise owner. I hated the head manager, right? Like that's just the way I experienced domination.
Are you telling me, Derek, that you don't hate Utah as a geographical area?
No, I do hate you. I don't. But what I was saying is, I actually hate Utah more than I hate my boss.
Okay.
Like,
I get you now. Is it the wild cats? Is it the large wild cats that roam everywhere on the streets, taking people down like zombies? Is that?
That would make this place so much more
features.
interesting. That would make it way more fun.
Oh God.
Yeah. Anybody, like, I know we've talked about what's missing in stratification earlier on as well. Is there anything here that people want to hit on before we move on to the next slide?
I think we've covered it. We've covered this.
Okay, so so the last slide on stratification, I think we should call a night after we finish stratification. Next week we'll do the next section. So stratification, so it says here, focus exclusively on the process by which individuals are sorted into positions, right? And the other two approaches analyze the nature of the positions themselves into which people are sorted. Okay. So yeah, it doesn't stratification doesn't talk much about like what it is to be like upper class versus lower class in relational terms. You know, it doesn't talk about, you know, I exploit you, you exploit. It just talks everything about at an individual level, and it just looks at how they sort out in the end. It's like some kind of Linnaeus kind of what would you call it? An exercise in classifying animals, you know, branches of animals or something. But it doesn't look at the process of evolution or how these things happen. That's probably a really bad analogy, but I think there's something in that.
It's typos and not. It is about. I'm going to use Aristotelian terms, which is going to make it so much more clear. But it's topos and not relation. It is. You see these. You can almost see stratifications. So one of the things about stratification theory is that it's value neutral in a really pernicious way. You can believe that like the classes are literally genetically distinct, and that like the Untermenschen are Untermenschen because they're genetically inferior, and believe in stratification theory. You can believe in meritocracy and believe in stratification theory, and you could be a kind of pinko socialist and believe in stratification theory. If all you think socialism is about is distribution. So stratification theory has no bearing on which of those like interpretive frameworks you're applying to it, because it's just about topos. It's just about where you are as an individual. You can put any explanatory model as to why you are. So yeah.
Yeah, it's actually fitting to bring in Aristotle here, right? Because Aristotle sometimes gets blamed for Western civilization's like fetish for categorization. But Aristotle was very interested in like the underlying rational mechanisms for why, you know, types emerge. So like there's, in a way, like if you are going to get like category obsessed, and when we're talking about class, we often get category obsessed. You know, it is a better approach to start thinking about those underlying causal mechanisms. But, you know, that doesn't mean you can't have fun, you know, sorting typologies or, you know, making rare Pokemon. I don't know. Like there's you can have fun with spreadsheets if you want. I'm not trying to yuck your yum there.
Yeah, I think, you know, just to sort of have a final statement on stratification, it is interesting that we got like very sidetracked in stratification discussion, like quite a lot. And I think it's not just because of the nature of our group, but because these attributes like really stand out to you in your mind, right? And like, oh, like all these little nitty gritties of what it is to be middle class and the lived experience of middle class. Like all this stuff is so tangible, and like often is related to like visceral experiences. And so yeah, there's kind of there's kind of a draw to this stuff, and to that like Pokemon classification that you're describing, Esri, that maybe isn't quite so present in the other two approaches, where it's a little bit more abstract, a little bit drier. Like even though you're like talking about relations and like that's in a way like a more real thing, it's still very easy to fetishize the attributes and just like get sidetracked into that.
Yeah, I think part of why we've been going off on this is because you deal with the stratification approach so much. That's for most people, even a lot of socialists. I don't know about most. I don't know what to say there. It's like when you get objections to Marxism, it's like, oh, what are we supposed to all have like equal individual attributes? I used to be very puzzled by that kind of response, but now I feel like I get it, because this is the way things manifest. I've been saying that over and over, but it's kind of a soft defense for a lot of tendencies and thought that drive me fucking crazy. Is that like there's a reason that people think about this one so much, that this one comes up the most. It's because the active like class antagonisms that you can perceive directly in your life, unless you're looking, unless you're like really like zooming in on like economic stuff, like the ones that like sometimes get at you the most are these weird little affective things, or when like somebody class sorts you by a habit you have or something.
Yes, exactly. Or when you do it to other people, right?
Yeah, like when you can tell that someone is from a background just because of there's just something in the air around them, like I can sniff out someone from like someone that's class LARPing from a mile away. Why can you do that? Like,
can you all smell the smell of cabbage off me? Like, can you smell that I'm Irish? Is that
through the computer, Tom?
Yeah, true. Smell of vision.
That's some loud, dank cabbage.
Oh, yes. You'll never guess what t-shirt I'm wearing today, though. My Rapids O'Brien. My
Chief of the Rapids.
Chief of the Rapids. Okay. I think that's our last one. Next week, we're going to hit on to Weber and then Marx, and we're going to get into, look at this. Look at that lovely graph there. Look at that.
Say, Weber's where we're going to get bogged down, man. If you think we got bogged down with stratification.
Yeah, but I mean, like, it's a different kind of thing, like with the stratification stuff, it's like, oh, like middle class people are like this is the way they think, and then you can just go on like this whole like mind tangent of like all these tangible attributes and affects that you hold or that you've experienced,
right?
Which is different from like the theoretical nuances of Weberianism.
Right. Well, it's actually funny because I was thinking about that. When I was in education, they give you this book to read. Well, I'm still in education. They give you this book to read about class. It's called Ruby Payne's Understanding Class. And it is basically like, you think this is bad or you think Purdue is, it's basically like, here be working class people. Here are their values. This is what they don't have access to. Here be middle class people. Here are their values. Here they don't have access to. And it actually is empirical work. But it is totally uncritical of like the framework, and it just like assumes it as like there's no even explanatory mechanism. Like, here's why working class people would value relationships more than systemic. Like other people have to fill that in. Which as a teacher is important to know. Like, but it's also just funny because I remember reading their description of like middle class values and working class, working and poor values, and they don't actually even talk about working class. It's poor, middle, rich, And I remember thinking, it seems like since this book was written, a lot of poor values have become middle class values, and so on. You'd had a value shift. And I wonder why that is. Oh, you can't deal with that because you're just dealing with typologies. And that is the stratification problem. It just ends up being typologies and doesn't explain it for the most part.
Yeah, when we get onto Weber, we'll at least be talking about something Marxists need to vitally understand rather than something Marxists, confuse with fundamental mechanisms all the time.
Okay. On that positive note, let's take it offline, and we'll see us all next week, hopefully. And yeah, we got halfway through one of these, so there is how many chapters? Like, I've tried my best.
The chapters actually get easier to talk about, even though we'll get madder at them.
Okay.
Like,
yeah.
I found that the first two are the most substantive.
Yeah,
Tom, I
can't wait to plot that. I can't wait to plot that neoclassical econ graph of where the intersect is between brevity and anger level.
Because by the time we get to chapter 9, like, some of us might stab each other, but it's not going to take us that long to get there.
Well, that's pretty quite good, because we'll all just it'll be one of these mass ritual stabbings. We'll just stab each other and it'll be dead air, and that'll be it. That'll be the end of the whole thing.
Like Suspiria, like we just.
Yeah. That's it. So there's 12 chapters. My God,
this is the graph. This is the anger and brevity graph. Actually, in this book, as it turns out, really weird.
I actually liked chapter 3. I thought chapter 3 was quite good. But there is a desperate graph on page 70. If you got your book, you should have a look at the graph. I looked at it I swear to God, I looked at it about 4 times, and each time I thought I understood it correctly, and they were all different.
So when I read this the first 2 times, I read it on Kindle, and the graphs were all botched.
Oh, gosh. You're probably lucky. You don't have to.
That's why you had to read it again. God.
Yeah. Right. Let's take this offline. Good luck, everybody in the chat. Thanks to everybody in the chat. I'm not going through. There's quite a lot in there today. I'm not going to shout you all now because I'm tired. I will talk to you next time. Sorry for being an hour late starting. Okay. See you all.
Bye.